Washington Square, New York, which is the home of NYU Abu Dhabi on the square. For many of you who probably don't know about NYU Abu Dhabi, it's an initiative to develop a full degree granting liberal arts university in Abu Dhabi in the UAE. We're now in our third year of operations, so we have freshmen, sophomores, and juniors. Many of them are now studying away in New York this semester, so it's a very exciting time for the university as it continues to evolve and have a global presence on nearly every continent. I'd also like to thank tonight the Islamic Center at NYU and its executive director, Khalid Latif, who is unfortunately not yet here. They're our co-sponsors, and we're very excited to be collaborating with them again this coming academic year with a full series of programming. And now turning to the main event, Lesley Hazleton. Lesley is an English-born writer who initially trained as a psychologist at Manchester University and Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She was based in Jerusalem for over a dozen years, where she reported on the Middle East for publications such as Time, the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, The Nation, and Harper's. Her writing covers a variety of topics that includes religion, history, and current affairs. She is the author of 11 books, which have been critically well received. After the Prophet, the epic story of the Shia-Sunni split was a finalist for the PEN USA Award in 2010. Mary, a Flesh and Blood biography, won the Washington State Book Award in 2005. Jerusalem, Jerusalem won the American Jewish Book Committee Award in 1986. And Israeli Women, The Reality Behind the Myth was the New York Times Best Book of the Year. Her writing has also been included in 10 anthologies, and you can also read Ms. Hazleton's regular postings on her blog, The Accidental Theorist. Excuse me. Which is an agnostic eye on religion, politics, and existence. Her most recent post, The Battle of the Muhammad Movies, is a highly entertaining read, and I very much suggest you start following her blog. Among her recent honors, she received the Stranger's Genius Award in Literature in 2011 and served as the inaugural scholar in residence at the Town Hall Seattle Civic and Cultural Center in 2012. Her 2010 TED Talk on the Quran went viral. Tonight, Ms. Hazleton will discuss her most recent book, The First Muslim, which will be on sale after this event, which is a biography of Muhammad's rise to power and fame. Her book seeks to separate the man from the myth, drawing upon eyewitness accounts that detail both the mystical as well as the fallible moments of Muhammad's life. And before I turn the event over to our guests, a couple of announcements. First, please turn off your cell phones if you still have them on. Second, we will be ending the event at 7:30, at which point we're going to whisk Lesley Hazleton downstairs to a book signing. So if you could hold off on some more personal questions until we get downstairs, that would be greatly appreciated. And without further ado,
I actually don't mind if the questions get personal, it's fine. What I'm going to do is read for about 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to move to the far more interesting part of the evening, which is you guys, and whatever you want to ask, declare, rant, rave about, is just fine by me. I would like to answer as many questions or comments and so on as I can. There probably won't be time, but we'll find out. There's only one way to do it, and that's to get started. This is clearly, as you know from the title, as a Muslim Small, you know from the title, this is a rather different point of view, a rather different way of looking at Muhammad. It's what you might call an outsider's point of view, an outsider trying to work her way inside. The reason I wrote the book was because the books that already existed didn't satisfy me. It was as though the more I read about Muhammad, and I read several biographies of him as background research for the previous book, After the Prophet, and I seemed to know a lot about him. It was rather like looking through a telescope the wrong way around, sort of everything got smaller instead of larger. He became more of a symbol and less of a person. And since my background is in psychology, I really wanted to feel for the man himself, for the integrity of a full life lived. My sources are the first, the earliest surviving Islamic biography, which of course is the Sirah of Nishak, and also which is from the 8th century, and the 9th and 10th century magisterial history of early Islam by Tabari. And these are my main sources. But they also include a lot of reading in comparative religion, in Middle East history, in anthropology, and my own experiences living in the Middle East, traveling in the Middle East. That sense of place is very important to me, as you'll see from this. Now, what I have chosen to read, me, of course, is the beginning of the book and a section from slightly later that is, and I'm deliberately doing this, I think you could say the most speculative part of the book. As an agnostic, I have great respect for the fact that not everything is knowable. But I also have great respect for the fact that everything is askable. So I ask without the presumption that my asking would result in knowing. The book is an exploration rather than saying, this is what happened, or this is how he definitely was. There's been plenty enough of that done already. And certainly if you have strong opinions one way or the other, this book is not for you, as will become very clear. So here's how it starts. If he weren't standing lonely vigil on the mountain, you might say that there was no sign of anything unusual about him. The earliest sources describe him with infuriating vagueness for those of us who need images. He was neither tall nor short, they say, neither dark nor fair, neither thin nor stout. But here and there, specific details do slip through, and when they do, they're surprising. Surely a man spending night after night in solitary meditation would be a gaunt, ascetic figure, yet far from being pale and wan, he had round, rosy cheeks and a ruddy complexion. He was stockily built, almost barrel-chested, which may partly account for his distinctive gait, described as always leaning forward slightly as though he were hurrying towards something. And he may have had a stiff neck, because people would remember that when he turned to look at you, he turned his whole body instead of just his head. The only sense in which he was conventionally handsome was his profile, the swooping hawk nose, long considered a sign of nobility in the Middle East. On the surface then, you might conclude that he was an average Meccan. At 40 years old, the son of a man he had never seen, he'd made a far better life for himself than had ever seemed possible. The child, born an outsider within his own society, had finally won acceptance and carved out a good life despite the odds against him. He was comfortably off, a happily married business agent with the respect of his peers, and if he wasn't one of the movers and shakers of his prosperous city, that was precisely why people trusted him to represent their interests. He'd found a secure niche in the world, and had earned every right in middle age to sit back and enjoy his rise to respectability. So what was he doing alone up here on one of the mountains that ring into the sleeping city below? Why would a happily married man isolate himself this way, standing in meditation through the night? There was a hint perhaps in his clothing. By now he could certainly have afforded the elaborate embroidered silks of the wealthy, but his clothes were low-key. His sandals were worn, the leather thongs sun-bleached paler than the skin. His homespun robe would be almost threadbare if it hadn't been so carefully patched, and it was hardly enough to shield him against the nighttime cold of the high desert. Yet something about the way he stood on the mountainside made the cold irrelevant. Tilted slightly forward as though leaning into the wind, his stance seemed that of someone who existed at an angle to the earth. Certainly, a person could see the world in a different way up here. He could find peace in the silence, with just the soughing of the wind over the rock of a company far from the fuse and gossip of the city. Here, a man was merely a speck in the mountain landscape, his mind free to think and reflect, and then perhaps finally to stop thinking, stop reflecting, and submit itself to the vastness. Look closer, and you might detect the shadow of loneliness in the corners of his eyes, something lingering there at the outsider he'd once been, as though he were haunted by the awareness that at any moment everything he'd worked so long and hard for could be taken away. You might see a hint of that same mix of vulnerability and resoluteness in his mouth, the full lips slightly parted as he whispered into the darkness. And then, perhaps, you'd ask why contentment was not enough. Did the fact that it had been so hard-earned make him unable to accept it as a given, never to be secure in his right to it? But then what would? What was he searching for? A certain peace within himself, perhaps? Or was it something more? A glimpse, maybe just an intimation, of something larger? One thing is certain. By Muhammad's own account, he was completely unprepared for what he would experience on this particular night in the year 610. A human encounters the divine. To the rationalist, a matter not a fact, but wishful fiction. So if Muhammad had behaved the way one might expect after his first encounter on Mount Hira, it would only make sense to call the story just that, a fable concocted by piety and belief. But he did not. He did not come floating off the mountain as though walking on air. He did not run down shouting hallelujah and bless the Lord. He did not radiate light and joy. There were no choirs of angels, no music of the spheres, no elation, no ecstasy, no golden aura surrounding him, no sense of his absolute, foreordained, unquestionable role as the messenger of God. Not even the whole of the Quran fully revealed, but only a few brief verses. In short, Muhammad did none of the things that might seem essential to the legend of a man who had just done the impossible and crossed the border between this world and another. On the contrary, he was convinced that what had happened couldn't have been real. At best, he thought it had to have been a hallucination, a trick of the eye or the ear or his own mind working against him. At worst, possession, and he'd been seized by an evil jinn, a spirit out to deceive him, even to crush the life out of him. In fact, he was so sure that he could only be Majnun, literally possessed by a jinn, that when he found himself still alive, his first instinct had been to finish the job himself, to leap off the highest cliff and escape the terror of what he experienced by putting an end to all experience. So the man who fled down the mountain that night trembled not with joy, but with a stark, primordial fear. He was overwhelmed not with conviction, but by doubt. He was sure of only one thing: whatever this was, it was not meant to happen to him, not to a middle-aged man who'd hoped perhaps at most for a simple moment of grace, instead of this vast, blinding weight of revelation. If he no longer feared for his life, he certainly feared for his sanity, painfully aware that too many nights in solitary meditation might have driven him over the edge. Whatever happened up there on Mount Hira, the sheer humanness of Muhammad's reaction may be the strongest argument for its historical reality. Whether you think the words he heard came from inside himself or from outside, it's clear that Muhammad did experience them, and that he did so with a force that would shatter his sense of himself and his world. Terror was the sole sane response. And if this strikes us now as unexpected, even shockingly so, that's only a reflection of how badly we've been misled by the stereotyped image of ecstatic mystical bliss. Lay aside such preconceived notions for a moment, and you might see that Muhammad's fear speaks of real experience. It sounds validly human. Too human for some, like conservative Muslim theologians who argue that the account of his trying to kill himself shouldn't even be mentioned, despite the fact that it's there in the earliest Islamic biographies. They insist that he never doubted for even a single moment, let alone despair. Demanding perfection, they cannot tolerate human imperfection. And perhaps this is why it can be so hard to see who Muhammad really was. The purity of perfection denies the complexity of a lived life. For Muslims worldwide, Muhammad is the ideal man, the prophet, the messenger of God. And though he's told again and again in the Quran to say that I am just one of you, just a man, reverence and love cannot resist the desire to clothe him, as it were, in gold and silver. There's a proprietary feeling about him, a fierce protectiveness, all the stronger at a time when Islam itself is under such intense scrutiny in the West. But the law of unintended consequences applies. To idealize someone is also, in a way, to dehumanize them, by which I mean to make them less human. So that despite the millions, if not billions, of words written about Muhammad, it can be hard to get any real sense of the man himself. The more you read, the more liable you are to come away with the feeling that while you may know a lot about him, you still don't know who he was, as though he's been all but smothered by the accumulated mass of all these words. Though the reverential legends about him are often magnificent, they work as perhaps all legends do. They obscure as much as they reveal, and he becomes more a symbol than a human being. So even as Islam is rapidly closing on Christianity as the world's largest religion, we still have little real sense of the man told 3 times in the Quran to call himself the first Muslim. His is without doubt one of the most consequential lives ever lived. Yet for all the iconic power of his name, or perhaps because of that, it's a life still to be explored. That's how the book starts. And I'm going to skip now to chapter 7, because it's taken me that long to work myself back to Mount Hira and what happened that night. And so imagine, if you can, this agnostic Jew, myself, pacing the floor of her houseboat in Seattle, asking this question that she knows is impossible to answer. What actually happened on Mount Hira? It's an absurd question, I know. We have what appear to be Muhammad's own words, but they come relayed through others at several removes, with each narrator struggling to translate the ineffable into terms they could understand. One account is credited to Aisha, the youngest and the most outspoken of the wives he'd marry after Khadijah's death. Khadijah, his first wife, he was married to in a loving, monogamous marriage of great mutual respect for 24 years until the death. So here's Aisha. He said, when the angel came to me, I'd been standing, but I fell to my knees and crawled away, my shoulders trembling. I thought of hurling myself down from a mountain crag, but he appeared to me as I was thinking this and said, Muhammad, I am Gabriel, and you are the messenger of God. Then he said, recite. I said, what shall I recite? He took me and pressed me tightly 3 times until I was nearly stifled and thought that I should die. And then he said, and the Muslims among you will recognize this from the Quran, even in English, recite in the name of thy Lord who created man from a clot of blood, that thy Lord is the most bountiful, who teaches by the word, teaches man what he knew not. The narrative then continues in words credited to one of Muhammad's future followers, Ibn Zubayr, who again quotes him directly. I recited it, and the angel desisted and departed. I woke up, and it was as though these words had been engraved on my heart. There was none of God's creation more hateful to me than a poet or a madman. This is with apologies to all poets. I could not bear to look at either of them, yet I thought, I must be either a poet or a madman. But if so, none will ever say this of me. I should take myself to a mountain cliff, hurl myself down from it, and find respite in death. But when I came near the top of the mountain, I heard a voice from heaven saying, Muhammad, you are the messenger of God. I raised my head to see who was speaking, and there Gabriel was, in the form of a man with feet astride the horizon. I stood looking at him, and this distracted me from what I'd intended, and I could go neither forward nor back. I turned my face away from him to all points of the horizon, but wherever I looked, I saw him in exactly the same form. Now, Aisha would say of this, and I quote her, "This was a true vision." This is a lovely way of putting it. It's so ambiguous. But the form it took in her mouth and those of others is almost clumsily flat. These were well-intentioned people trying to find words for a state of being they'd never experienced. And in the process, they simplified it, turning the metaphysical into the merely physical, as in that image of the angel Gabriel straddling the mountains. It's as though the moment itself were cloaked. I almost wrote veiled there, I thought. Too bad. As though too close an account of what happened that night were beyond human comprehension, which is in fact exactly how Muhammad experienced it. Where his reported words come to life is not in the angelic apparition, but in that palpable feeling of terror, that panicked disorientation, that sundering of everything familiar, that feeling of being utterly overwhelmed to the point of near death by a force larger than anything the mind can comprehend. In short, a terrible awe. Now, this may be difficult to grasp today when the word awesome is used to describe a new app or a viral video. And it's okay, good enough. With the exception perhaps of a massive earthquake, we're protected from real awe. Few people even know any longer what it's like to stand alone in a thunderstorm on the open plains, or to feel the shore vibrate beneath you as a gale sends billions of tons of water pounding in across thousands of miles of ocean. You can tell I'm from the West Coast. We close the doors and hunker down, convinced that we're in control, or at least hoping for control, and lose touch with what it is to be overwhelmed by a force much larger than ourselves. How then to understand Muhammad's book? Something that is metaphysical, beyond the physical, is by definition beyond rational explanation. But while the attempt to reconstruct mystical experience may well be absurd, one can, or rather I can, at least be a fool for trying, rather than a different kind of fool for not trying. Rudolf Otto, has anyone met him? Rudolf Otto, The Idea of the Holy? One. The great Victorian scholar of comparative religion may have come close in his book, The Idea of the Holy, though in the rather overly impassioned language of his era, which was the Victorian era. The fear of God in the Hebrew Bible, he wrote, seizes upon man with paralyzing effect. As I say, it's the Victorian era, and obviously does not have this effect on women. Job. Okay, don't laugh. Come on, guys. Job, he wrote, experienced a terror fraught with an inward shuddering, such as not even the most menacing and overpowering created thing can instill. It has something spectral in it. And Professor Otto really did mean spectral. In ghost stories, he continued, the sense of dread makes you shudder, going so deep that it seems to penetrate to the very marrow, making a man's hair bristle and his limbs quake. But at its highest level, he wrote, dread reappears in a form ennobled beyond measure, where the soul, held speechless, trembles inwardly to the furthest fibre of its being. But if we don't need to be quite as purple-prosed as Rudolf Otto, neither do we have to be as literal as Aisha or Ibn Zubayr. We don't need to insist, well, I don't need to insist, that Muhammad actually heard Gabriel speaking as though the angel were a human being, let alone reduce Muhammad to the status of a kind of divinely appointed voice recorder playing back what was dictated to him. Since we are rational products of the 21st century, we might instead look to science for an explanation, calling on neuropsychiatry and the idea of altered states of consciousness. Was Muhammad in such an altered state that night of Mount Hira? Of course he was. But neurological research has only revealed what ascetics and mystics have always known, that practices such as fasting, sleep deprivation, intense meditation, sometimes also dancing, singing, and chanting, can induce such states, which are accompanied by changes in the brain's chemical activity. The fact that an altered state of consciousness has a physical correlate should come as no surprise, since brain chemistry parallels experiential input. But to then imagine that everything is explained by chemistry is to fall into the reductive trap of what William James called medical materialism, which dismisses experience in favor of mechanics. So while science can chart the physical effects of such altered states, it can't enter the experience of them. In the end, at least for me, the most practical way to pursue the question may be the one that at first glance might seem the least practical of all, and that is by making the leap into poetry. The essence of religious experience is at heart poetic. Ritual and dogma are merely the framework of organized religion. It's good as it were. They do not touch on religious experience itself, which is the experience of mystery, of the indescribably enigmatic. Poetry, of course, pivots on enigma. And this, of course, has not prevented many poets from trying to define it nonetheless. Walt Whitman called the beauty of poems the tuft and final applause of science, which has to be thought of as a nicely phrased response to medical materialism. Coleridge, Samuel Taylor, talked of the willing, you'll know this one, the willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which constitutes poetic faith. While Ralph Waldo Emerson called poetry the endeavor to express the spirit of the thing. And note here the words they use, faith and spirit. Yet the most apt definition of poetry may be the anonymous one, which is saying something that cannot be said. Which again is no reason not to try. If we look then at the metaphors in the account of Muhammad on the mountain, it may be possible to at least begin to understand. Start then with the idea of inspiration. Literally the act of breathing in or of being breathed into. The Arabic word for both breath and spirit is ruh, close kin to the Hebrew ruach. The idea of having spirit breathed into is thus built into the language, as it is in the second verse of Genesis, where the breath of God, Ruach Elohim, lay upon the waters. But while this may sound wonderful in principle, consider that a human being is not water. Imagine, if you can, being breathed into, inspired, with such force that your body can hardly bear it. No gentle breath from heaven here, but air being impelled into your lungs under immense pressure, as though a giant were giving you mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. It feels like every cell of your body is overtaken by it, and you're entirely at its mercy. Even as it gives you life, it seems to be squashing the life out of you, suffocating you under its enormous weight, until it's useless to even think of fighting against it. And then consider the real meaning of that phrase of Muhammad's, as though these words were engraved on my heart. If this is by now a cliché, consider it afresh as he used it, and you begin to grasp its impact. If you've read Franz Kafka's story in the penal colony, people have, you'll think instantly of the prisoner suffering the words of his penitence being carved letter by letter into his flesh. Imagine then the unimaginable. The agonizing pain of a sharp blade carving deep inside you as you lie beneath it, conscious but unable even to struggle against it. Again, no unearthly calm here. Instead, it has all the violence of open-heart surgery, the wrenching apart of the chest, the baring of the heart, the unutterable pain, all in the name of a new peace. unlocked. Muhammad was left cowering on the ground, depleted. Covered in sweat yet shivering, he was inhabited by those words that were his and yet not his. The words he had repeated out loud into the thin, pure air of the mountain, into the emptiness and into the darkness. Maybe he sensed somewhere inside him that these words could only come to life, could only achieve human reality when spoken into the face of, breathed in by another human being, the one person he could run to for consolation in the face of this overwhelming force. Khadija, his wife. Or perhaps at first there were no words at all. Perhaps it took time for experience to form into something as human and tangible as words. We know that he came stumbling down the mountain, slipping and sliding on the loose scree, his breath hot and rasping, each inhalation needing to be struggled for until it felt like his chest would burst with the effort of it. His robe was torn, his arms and legs scratched and bruised by thorns and sharp-edged rocks in the path of his headlong flight for home. "I have been in fear for my life," was the first thing he said. "I think I must have gone mad." Trembling, shuddering almost convulsively, he begged Khadija to hold him and hide him under her shawl. Cover me, he pleaded, his head in her lap, like a small child seeking shelter from the terrors of the night. And that terror alone was enough to convince her that what her husband had experienced was real. She held him, cradled him as the night sky began to grow pale in the east with the reassuring prospect of day. Slowly, haltingly, the words he had perhaps felt more than heard began to find physical shape in his mouth. Even as he still shook in Khadijah's arms, Muhammad found his voice, and the first revelation of the Quran formed into words that another human being could hear. What had been breathed into him up on the mountain was now breathed out to take its place in the world. As I say, that's obviously, clearly, my far the most speculative part of the book, generally accused much more closely to more solid historical detail. But then, of course, me being me, that's exactly why I chose to read it. The rest of the time we have is entirely up to you guys. Whatever you want to ask, I will answer or say that I can't answer. Whatever you want to rant or rave, or say, Lesley, you got it all wrong, or Lesley, how dare you, or what chutzpah, which of course it is, but I'm Jewish, what do you expect? Please, over to you. Yeah.
I was wondering, there seems to be a context of other monotheistic religions in the parts you read. Do we know anything about Muhammad's contact with other religions at that time?
We don't know for sure. We do know that a full third of the Quran is dedicated to reprising the biblical stories of the prophets, of the great prophets, in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. I think it is very reasonable. We do know that Muhammad worked on the trade caravans to Damascus. And Damascus was a huge capital. It was the center of civilization at the time. Everybody came there. Jews, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists. This was where the world met in Damascus. Now, these caravans, I know that sounds quite exotic in modern terms. We think of, the usual, thank God that isn't on the cover of the caravans and sand dunes and so on. Thank you, Riverhead, for not doing that. These were very, very sophisticated affairs. 2,000 camels at a time. They were organized basically as trade cartels. They were huge endeavors. You did not take 2,000 camels at a time, 700 miles. That took a month each way to Damascus in order to do a kind of 7th century version of a touch and go at Damascus airport, turn straight around and come back again. You settled in to the places you traded with. You extended hospitality. You received hospitality. You listened to the elders. You listened to the stories of other people. You told your stories in return and so on. This was not just an exchange of trade and of goods. It was an exchange of ideas and of culture. And it seems to me totally reasonable to assume that in Damascus, and also in Yemen, which is where the second major caravan went each year, Muhammad would have heard many, many of the stories and beliefs of both Jews and Christians. And don't forget, to the north was all the Byzantine Empire at the time, it was Christian. And heard them in many, many versions that were current at the time and have since dropped out of currency. And we keep editing our sacred texts, so now there's sort of one accepted version in the West. But if you travel through the Middle East, you can hear many of the versions that are told in the Quran, still from Christians and Jews in the Middle East, which totally, I mean, one perfect example came when I wrote that book about Mary as a virgin, but I did go to Magdalene, which was the home of Mary Magdalene, where this guy told me this beautiful story. He said, it's a long story of how, but it was the story of Jesus. You know it from the New Testament, I'm sure, that he was without sin, throw the first stone, right? In the way he told it, it was Jesus bends down, picks up a stone, and says, throw the first stone at her, right, at the woman in sin. The way he told it, it was Jesus bends down, picks up a stone, hits himself on the head with the stone and says that he was without sin, throw the first stone at me. Which is just wonderful. He's put himself between this woman and a crowd that wants to stone him. And it's a lovely variant. Who's to say which one is right and which one is wrong, which one's correct and which one is incorrect, which one is authentic and which one is inauthentic. We take the beauty of the stories for what they are. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. Yeah.
Hi. I really enjoyed your account, both the pieces that you read, and I couldn't help but draw parallels, some parallels to the very classic parallel of Das Book Zarathustra. And I struggle with this, and I'll ask you to bear with me as I articulate this thought. So you've described Muhammad to have a very simple, very humanistic experience. And that's
simple,
yeah, but simple in the sense that it drew a lot of parallels to being a human, as many of just a parallel. But at the same time, we see this sort of very strong introspect, this sort of wanderer feeling, going up to the mountains, self-reflection, thought, reasoning, looking within himself, and sort of the hard coat that you have sort of described. It had to do with him finding something from within, psychoanalysis, sort of anything that we might be metaphysical or physical, we don't know. But at the same time, taking sort of Nietzsche's philosophy, not rejecting the metaphysical, but taking that philosophy that it is upon the individual being to sort of look within and sort of find whatever that it is that you might call God. Mm-hmm. How do you sort of reconcile the strength of this argument with the organized religion that Islam has come to be? And sort of Prophet's preaching methods.
Religion, as opposed to faith, really is a human construct. And what we have done to it, all of us, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, is so far from what the figures we consider sacred intended. I think in many, sometimes it's very close, and I love it. Sometimes it's terrifyingly, almost the opposite. It's like a travesty. And very often an obscene travesty that involves blood, and it's always, of course, other people's blood. But it's fascinating what you said, because one of the things that most distinguishes Muhammad, to my mind, is that he started off purely as a spiritual leader, but it was this totally unique combination of spiritual leadership and political leadership. I mean, why was he up there on the mountain? That was another question that haunted me. Of course, I can't know for sure. But I do know that for the first 5 years of his life, he didn't live in Mecca. He was sent out fostered with the Bedouin family on the other side of the mountains for 5 years, which is very unusual. Usually it was for 2 years until the child was weaned, and then he'd be sent back. Except there was nowhere for Muhammad to be sent back to. His father was dead. His mother had not remarried, which is really strange. You know that something is wrong here. And he comes back after 5 years spent with the Bedouin, which is this very egalitarian society, where a tribe is only as strong as its weakest member. And he comes back to Mecca, which, okay, it's a gross analogy, but still I'll use it, which is like the sort of 7th century Arabian equivalent of a Wall Street bull market. It's run by this combination of piety and profit, P-R-O-F-I-T. And he's shocked, that these are his own people, and he's an outsider. He feels like an outsider within his own people. So very early on, I think he sensed that there was something very, very wrong here. That basically, the 1% were running the show, and the 99% were, etc. And he felt this early on. If you look at the revelations, you'll see there are, one reason why he engendered so much opposition from the Quraysh elite, the elite of Mecca, was that basically what he was preaching was totally subversive. It was radical. It said an end to this, an end to profiting off other people's piety, an end to unequal distribution of wealth, an end to gender discrimination. By the way, that one went really quickly, didn't it? But it was true, I mean, an outrage several times in the Quran, an outrage, outcry against sons being preferred over daughters and so on. It was a message, basically, of what we now call social justice. And this fascinates me because if you go back to early Judaism and early Christianity, the original versions, as Jesus preached it, as someone like Elijah preached it, for all of this false, you'll find that it's a protest against power. It's a protest against the corruption that comes with power. The corruption of the power elite, whether it's kings, as in the Hebrew Bible, or Roman occupation, as in the Greek in the New Testament, or the power of the oligarchy, as in the Quran. And this fascinates me. I think it's wonderful. It's like all three monotheisms began as such radical social justice movements, and then, of course, they became institutionalized. And okay, let me, at the risk of insulting anybody here who is elderly with a long white beard, please forgive me, but the old men with long white beards took over and established basically religion as a power structure. It became, where the emphasis was on just that structure, on the girders, and they forgot the spirit of it. There's a wonderful quote, and I know this is really weird, an agnostic Jew standing here talking in the Islamic Center and quoting St. Paul, of all people. But there's a wonderful quote from Corinthians that says, "The letter kills, the spirit gives life." I wish I could sort of engrave that on the heart of every fundamentalist, of all stripes, of all religions.
With all due respect, what I said, there is a much parallel between the Jew religion and Islamic religion. And if you look at the biography of Moses, when he went to the mountain and received 10 commandments, they were scared. And he did not come across with any other religion before. So he was scared. So there's a resemblance with Prophet Sallallahu that he was, that means, that showed, and the Quran also saying that he was a human being. And we believe that he was a human being. But he was a human being. So, but when we look at the results of Prophet Moses and Prophet Sallallahu, there is a same thing, that the result was great. And they were constant in their struggle. And they were receiving guidance from God.
What fascinates me though, in the account of Muhammad, I mean, Moses came down off the mountain with the tablets of the law. He wasn't literally saying, "Hallelujah, bless the Lord," but actually he was. He came down with the truth. Capital T, always comes with a capital T. He said, this is it, guys, right? And, you all be damned if you don't believe it. Muhammad came down in a very, very different way. And what fascinates me is that for 2 years after that first revelation, there were no revelations. And he spent those 2 years, there was silence. He spent those 2 years struggling in what the mystics, what St. John of the Cross calls the dark night of the soul, as I see it. Questioning, was this just my imagination? Was this just wish fulfillment on my part? Was this real? Will it happen again? How could I even imagine that I should be the prophet of my people and so on? And then when the voice does come again, 2 years later, the first thing it tells him is, you are not alone. We have not forsaken you. But you've struggled, etc., and then the revelations begin to come as they would, fairly constantly through the rest of his life. And this strikes me as something very, very different. When I read about Moses, somebody once suggested that I write a biography of Moses, and I said, yeah, but there's no there. There's a legend there, I can see it, but I can't see any way to reach an actual human being there. I only see a legend. With Muhammad, I can see, or I think I can see, or I've been trying to see, to explore the man behind the legend. And I think the man, the real man, the actual story of his life, fallible as well. What was not so good as well as what's good is actually far more remarkable and far more worthy of the word of the description legendary than the very great body of devotional legend that's been written about it. But obviously, as I said, this is not a devotional biography. It's a historical and psychological one. And if you're deeply attached to the devotional stories, to the hadith and so on, you will not enjoy it.
I'm actually glad that you read some of the speculative passages, because I was really taken by your style and how often I heard your voice coming through in this biography of Muhammad. And I found that to be really interesting. And I was wondering if you can maybe reflect on your own choice of words and your own kind of intercessions, because you say at moments, like for example, the moment where he parts company with his birth mother to go and live with Halima, you sort of imagine a scene where her heart is being wrenched from her as she's leaving her boy. And then you include your own voice when you say, but there's no record of any such scene, right, which is almost certainly more 21st century sentiment than 6th century reality. And you've got these interesting moments where you do reflect on your own position as a 21st century historian, being preoccupied with all of these kinds of issues of how can fundamentalism resemble different types of extremism resemble one another in such ways when it's religion that's supposed to unify people. And I'm wondering maybe if you can sort of answer a very basic question, which is looking at all these speculative moments and these asides that you put in your book, if you can answer the question of why you wrote this book.
The most immediate and I can answer that question, of course, on so many levels. So let me answer it just on two for the time being. The first level was frustration, as I explained at the beginning, that none of the existing biographies, except for the early ones, except for Ibn, turn to Ibn Ishaq and Al-Tabari, and you think, oh my God, there it is, there's the juice, there's the vitality, there's real people talking, there's, and all the quotes from the book, of course, come from Ibn Ishaq or Al-Tabari, or from the Quran itself. I did not make up any dialogue. I wouldn't dare. But I'm not a fiction writer. But the so it was frustration. It was I felt that his life, this amazing life. This is a man who not only radically changed his world, he's still changing ours. So how can so many people in the West know so very little about him? And what they do know is on the level of stereotype and so on. Camels and sand dunes and etc. So I really wanted to do justice to his story, to this remarkable story. On another level, another level is there in the subtitle of the blog, The Accidental Theologist, which is an agnostic eye on religion, politics, and existence. I've reported for a long time from the Middle East and so on, and I am just totally fascinated by, in this attracted and repulsed at the same time, which I think is practically a definition of fascination, by this vast and volatile arena in which politics and religion intersect more in the Middle East than in any other place in the world, I think. And it's like I can't let go of it, even though I'm agnostic, even though I'm not a practicing person of faith in the sense of religious faith. I have a different kind of faith, an agnostic faith, which I tend to place in people rather than in God. Still, that's what gnaws at me. That's what fascinates me. That's what keeps me going. Not because I'm looking for any specific answer. I think I'd be disappointed if I came up with a specific answer, but just the sheer pleasure of looking. People sometimes say to me, to one of these sort of new Christian terms, one of these spiritual terms, just that, if anyone can come up with a better word than spirituality, I would love that, please, because I'm looking for one right now. It's become so demeaned by overuse. I've forgotten where I was going. Sorry, I got all caught up again trying to think of a better word than spirituality. We should let a few other people ask. Yeah. Okay, the guy first and then behind.
I'm sorry. My question is regarding that you started off, you see in the life of Prophet Muhammad that it is about social justice, 1% versus 99%, gender discrimination, and so on and so forth earlier on in his life. But there's something that happens after he moves to Medina. It's a kind of like a transform from a kind of like a spiritual leader talking about social justice to establishing himself as a political leader / commander-in-chief. Things get more bloody. There's wars, battles, and so on and so forth. What exactly in your mind happens? I mean, you start of the book with this revelation he's getting from from up there,
yeah.
And in Medina it's something like more like it's like it doesn't connect, and for many people it doesn't connect, and others. So like
Yeah, this is why sometimes when people say, I can't get through more than a few pages of the Quran. I say, well, try reading it without any sense of disrespect. Try reading it as though it's in Arabic from the right to the left. Read it from the back, because the shorter surahs towards the end tend to be the earliest ones from the Meccan time rather than the Medinan time, and they're the ones where you'll find more of the sort of inspirational, sort of metaphysical aspects, and it's more poetic. The longer ones, nobody agrees on exactly who organized the Quran this way, but the longer ones the longer surahs towards the beginning are very, very heavy with historical detail, and they take for granted that you know the historical background, which of course comes to the Quran from nowhere. You don't, and therefore they're very, very hard to understand, and sometimes, as you say, quite shocking. When Muhammad was exiled from Mecca, and it was exile, I know that the hijrah is usually translated as emigration, but emigration implies that you willingly went. He did not. He was forced out of Mecca after a concerted attempt in his life, not just a threat of assassination, but an actual attempt at assassination, with a small number of his followers. Went 200 miles north to Medina, where, nobody is more an outsider than an exile. Especially at that time in that place where you were defined by where you came from. Al-Tabari means the one from Tabara, right? Al-Bukhari is the one from Bukhara and so on. This was such an essential part of your identity. It's hard for us to grasp nowadays when we're so very geographically mobile and so on. The impact of this kind of exile. And yet, out of that, it is the most astonishing thing. He formed this new, highly idealistic communitarian, egalitarian society in Medina. But he became the political leader, and with political leadership comes responsibilities of defense and deciding when to take up arms. And he did take up arms 3 times. There were 3 battles. Actually, when you look at them closely, they were more like skirmishes. What's remarkable about them is actually how few people were killed in them. But they become famous, sort of enshrined as the famous 3 battles of early Islam between Medina, where he was now the leader, and Mecca, which had rejected him, exiled him. Only to take him back 8 years later, 8 years after he was exiled, he would be acclaimed. He would come back to Mecca with hardly any loss of life and negotiated surrender as the ultimate insider. It's an amazing transformation that's gone on here. So yes, this is difficult for those of us who like things nice and clear, who would like Muhammad to be the prophet of peace or the prophet of war, the sword-wielding warrior or the Gandhi, and so on. It's hard for us to look at these things and say, well, maybe he was all these and more. Maybe when you take someone of this stature, you cannot pigeonhole them. You cannot cut them down to just, he was this or he was that. If you want to give him a full life, you must allow him the contradictions of that life too. And who here does not have contradictions in their life? That's part of what it is to be human. And I know this is very difficult for some people, and a lot of people much rather I had sort of sidestepped around the use of violence and so on. I don't think this does any respect to your subject, to sort of edit his life. And what interested me was not just what happened and when it happened, but how it happened and why it happened. And the violence will be shocking. And you can sense, I sense in any case, in those 8 years, I can sense that this was problematic. I can sense it in the Quran too, that it was never unambiguous. There was always the feeling that with it, this is something that had to be justified. This is something we'd rather not be doing. Yes, you can kill the unbeliever, but only if he attacks you first, and only if he tries to stop you getting to the Kaaba, and only if it's hedged around with conditions here. And then every time it says, but God is merciful, forgiveness is supreme. So then essentially what it says is, better if you don't. And this strikes me very, very strongly. So you can do with the Quran what you can do with the Bible. In fact, it's much worse you can do with the Bible. Or even with the words of Jesus. You can take your yellow highlighter and you can highlight just a few words and you can quote them out of context and you will have the most terrifying vision of what was going on then and what this religion is about and what the sacred text is about. Because what happens when you take things out of context and when you mistranslate them also. But sacred texts survive because they're not unambiguous, because they are mysterious and they are enigmatic, and they do include contradictions. If they were so clear-cut, they would not have held our imaginations for 2,500 years, for 2,000 years, for 1,400 years, in the cases of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It is that enigmatic quality that makes them so fascinating to us, that grasps our imagination, that holds us not exactly in thrall, but in inquiry, in awe, a certain amount of awe. But there was the woman in the back.
And this will be the last question.
I wonder if in your investigations you looked into the story regarding the revelation that involves the 3 goddesses.
Yeah.
And I suppose the satanic verses, but whether you looked into that and the context of it and the significance of it. And I also had a very brief question, which is, how did he know that this was Jibreel? this was Angel Gabriel. Does Jibril announce that, or is there some iconography by which he knew?
Yeah.
Curious.
Yeah, well, in Aisha and Ibn Zubayr's version, of course, he says, I am Gabriel, and you are, and so on. Personally, I tend to suspect the Gabriel thing, a bit later, was added in later, by Aisha and by Ibn Zubayr, in other words, personifying the divine presence and so on. But let's go to your real question, which is about the satanic verses, which is another incident, another part of his life that I know many devout Muslims would much rather I'd skipped over and hadn't mentioned at all. Put aside Salman Rushdie for the time being. No, I have to tell you that is a wonderful novel, and I'm sorry more people haven't read it because it's a novel about displacement, about home and being displaced, and about the feeling of home and being outsider, being insider. On the other hand, it is also, of course, since he is a very sharp satirist, a very sharply satirical novel. Well, you've already been warned. But wait, let me just start to answer her question. You've already asked a question here. Personally, I don't quite understand the objection, the satanic verses. What happened was as follows. And this is again from Nishat and so on, the earliest surviving biographies. Muhammad was under severe pressure from the rulers of Mecca, because what he was saying was one God and one God only, no associates with God, right? So none of the totem gods, the various tribes and so on, only Allah. And Allah was, the reigning God of Mecca, as it were, but sort of remote, not approachable. So there were all these totem gods who were intercessors, as it were, sort of beautiful, just unusual stones that were placed in the courtyard of the Kaaba that you could worship, you could touch them, you could make offerings to them, you could implore, you could decorate them with beads and with scarves and so on and so on. You could talk to them, and if you did it right, then they presumably would talk back to you. Of course, there were always interpreters, the priests and so on, who would interpret, and of course, had to be paid. These were traditional totems of the various tribes. So what Muhammad was doing, he was going against tradition. And the traditions of the fathers, the ways of the fathers, it was called. And anyone who knows the Middle East knows how important respect for the fathers is. Not just your own father, your grandfather, and great-grandfather. And it had deteriorated to the point of, partly because of that, and partly because it was indeed a radical message of social justice, an economic message. He and his followers, a very small group of followers, like the early Christian believers who gathered around Jesus, he and his followers were being severely harassed, both verbally and even physically. And under his orders were offering no resistance, passive resistance. It was downright Gandhian, in fact. But still the pressure was there, and the pressure was on his own clan too, who had been boycotted because of this, because they stood by him and so on, and refused to expel him. And he gets kind of involved here, but under the pressure, he got these verses, this revelation that said, okay, the three main goddesses who were then called the daughters of Allah, right? And they were the three sort of sub-goddesses, as it were, of Mecca at the time. These are like giant birds with huge wingspans, and they are intercessors, and it's okay. And immediately everyone's like, yay, you're back in the fold, you're one of us, everything's forgiven, no more harassment, no more blah, 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 you're a good guy. Because everybody believes in Allah in any case, just Allah was too remote for them. And then he gets another revelation, almost immediately saying, Muhammad, this was not from God. This was a satanic revelation. Don't feel too bad about it. It's happened to other prophets before you. You're not the only one this has happened to. You're only human. But you can't let this stand. And he doesn't. And he knows what's going to happen now. Because he knows that the moment he stands up in public and takes back those verses and says, I got it wrong. I gave these verses in error. This is what I should have said. He knows that the moment he says that, the harassment, both verbal and physical, is going to just multiply, which indeed it does. And I look at this as an act of great courage. I see it as nothing to be ashamed of. I see it as not an event to be covered over in any way. Was Muhammad fallible? Did he make a mistake? Yes. What is so wrong with making a mistake? What is so wrong with being fallible, and what is so wrong with being human? So this is my take on the satanic verses. I see it as a demonstration, not of his being wrong, but of his courage for standing up for what was right, which sometimes involves knowing it's wrong. Okay, we have to. I'm getting the look here.